Greetings, top of the day, everybody. Steve, the amateur historian. How y'all doing today? I'm okay. I'm okay today. And I'm just here to do what I do best, which is to ramble about stuff. I really truly think the reason I ramble so long, which definitely sometimes has an effect on the length of my videos, is because I literally couldn't get a word in, it seemed, till I was like 20 years old. I was either too scared to talk to people I was around, or my dad was rambling, wouldn't shut up, and there was a lot of time spent just not talking and not expressing myself. So I think that now that I'm more comfortable in that realm, now I just don't shut up half the time. Sorry. But I recently did a bit, and I kind of want to do these a little more often. They almost kind of get at the crux of things that I've discussed on my channel, but never done a video specifically just focused on it or focused on one thing as a whole. I did a bit talking about the history and the effects of the unwritten law in my last one of these recordings, because I've encountered that so many times doing particularly historic murders of Portland episodes. And yeah, the unwritten law was essentially this idea. And I actually forgot to include, I actually read a piece written on Offbeat Oregon History, which is a great website. When I was first starting out doing videos for my channel and looking for historical stuff, I hit up off the Offbeat Oregon History page frequently to try to find interesting things that happened in and around my area. And that was actually where I first discovered pieces delving into stories directly related to the unwritten law. But I focused it entirely on husbands and wives, but I forgot it could also apply to if somebody was doing something like that similar to a close family of yours. More specifically, a brother's sister. There was a case I covered in a recent, or semi-recent, probably about a year ago almost, Historic Murders of Portland episode. I delved into the murder of a guy named Lincoln Whitney, who was shot by a guy named Orlando Murray, based on what Murray perceived as Whitney just horribly mistreating his sister. And he ended up killing him one day, and they tried to utilize, kind of the unwritten law for that he was watching over the sanctity of his sister. One of my favorite, I always say, I try to never advocate, hey, somebody shot this guy and it was pretty badass. I try not to advocate that. I try not to advocate the positives of killing another person for, I hope you'd realize, obvious reasons. But there's a few instances where that's kind of where I'm at. There's a guy named Nils Carlson who, back in I covered this in the last episode, 1918, found out that his buddy Gus Johnson, who he let use his garage, had lured his wife into a pantry. And then after his wife passed out, he, let's just say, did things to her. And Nils Carlson, who had been kind of afraid of Johnson, just went red. He walked out to the garage where Johnson was working, had Johnson get out from under the car he was working, fired 5 shots into him, killed him on the spot. And then tragically, Carlson committed suicide in jail a couple days later. But beyond that, another story I love, and I can't remember the name of the guy that did it. I remember Carlo Bernato was the name of the guy that got killed. And Carlo Bernanto was this punk who him and a friend had tried to lure this one guy's underage sister to a house, presumably to do stuff to her. And the brother found out about it and managed to get her wages in time, but Bernanto was angry. He was raged. He was like, I'll do whatever I want to your sister whenever I want. So this guy was, your run-of-the-mill scumbag. And he started, menacing them outside of Bernanto started menacing them outside of their house. And finally, the brother, again, I wish I could remember his name, finally went outside and they had an encounter, and the brother shot Bernanto dead on the sidewalk. And I'm kind of like, way to go, bruh, in honor of the sister. So the unwritten law would apply to that as well. I just know I didn't reference that in my last bit. But anyway, the unwritten law was something that I've mentioned in numerous videos. So this was a chance to talk about that thing in particular and the cases connected to it. And this flows along the same lines of that. It goes back to some videos I did about 3 years ago, but also some videos that I've more recently done, mostly in the mystery murder series I've done. I think a video or two I did even before I started actually doing that series. And it's, again, these things that I kind of cover in these particular discussions are things that maybe someday in the future I'll do a video specifically focused on it. Maybe that'll happen. In which case this recording it'll at least be less relevant. But I you never know. I have so many things I want to do for my channel, and you can only work at such a pace. And again, I'm trying to not overwork myself as much. So this is another one of those things where multiple videos I've done have kind of gotten to the heart of this concept, but I haven't done a video, and I have contemplated it, doing a video specifically focused on this, and it's this string of murders against women that primarily occurred during the 1970s into the 1980s a little bit. That and it was mostly in, I guess, what I would call the middle Willamette Valley, mostly in the Salem Corvallis area. I've covered, oddly enough, in that series, I've covered a lot of cases from Eugene. And only recently have thought about that I've covered 4 cases from Eugene. But yeah, there was all of these random murders, and most of them were women, and a lot of them have gone unsolved. A lot of them, you don't really find much information about them aside from the handful of newspaper articles. A couple of these cases that I've covered, I've had to use almost strictly just old newspaper articles because there's no other resources out there. Half the time, you can't even figure out who their relatives were, who they were related to, and maybe what they had to say on it, what they knew about it. Just very limited info, which is tragic to a degree because it makes these cases so easy to forget. And in that vein, there's one particular case that I think of all the cases that I've covered, at least in that mystery murder series, to this point, this is the one that stays with me the most. Some cases just stay with you more than others. It's not necessarily that you feel they have more significance than other cases. They just stay with you for whatever reason. And yeah, and I'll get to that case, obviously. But yeah, when I tried to look up information on it, there was nothing. There was 4 results. And I think pretty much all of them were just stuff I'd done. They linked back to the video that I'd done on YouTube about it. There was a vlog I'd written where I think I briefly referenced that case. That popped up. There's nothing. I, stumbled onto that case using the newspapers.com that I use, and without that, you'd practically never even know that this case existed. I think, maybe on the county's like cold case site, I think there's like a little, but there's like a little blip about it. This happened. They were last seen dressed like this. They were last seen with a person that looked like this. They were last seen in this town, in that house, whatever. And just like, if you have any information, please contact our cold case unit. But aside from that, nothing else to really even let you know that event had even occurred. And, it's just very interesting that there was, at the time, there was a lot of light shown on these cases. I would stumble onto a lot of newspaper articles that would list out all of these unsolved crimes from, they usually be in like newspaper articles from like the end of the 70s or into the early 80s, referencing back to all these cases from the 70s that had, lingered unsolved. And there was even more cases going into the 80s that seemed like they were destined to go unsolved. There was the victims of this guy, William Scott Smith. And there was this string of women that he killed in the early 80s that loomed unsolved for a long time. And I remember there was Sherry Irely was the name of one of his victims, who I believe her remains have still never been found. And it was this really, she was lured into a trap, essentially. And she worked at Domino's I believe it was Domino's in Salem. And they got a call for delivery. And the delivery drop-off was the kind of the end of this road off to the end of town. Even today, it's kind of a rural area. And it seems like she came there to do her delivery, and she was ambushed. Never seen alive again. And there was a couple other women. I know that there was a woman. I want to say her last name was, again, I remember the specifics of stuff, but sometimes some of these cases I haven't covered in like 3 years. But there was a woman who I believe her last name was Darling, and she worked at a Circle K in Salem, and she was working the overnight shift. And it's one of those stories. A customer walks in, sees her there, walks out. Someone comes in a little bit later, and the night person's gone. During this like short period of like 20 minutes or something, she was grabbed. Turned up dead. There was another woman who was a University of Willamette student, turned up dead. And it was ultimately determined that this guy, William Scott Smith, was responsible. Even as I was covering all of these cases, I didn't even realize that he committed another murder in with that bunch. There's actually a murder that I missed when I did my original video on that. And I think he even killed many, many years later, he killed his girlfriend. Just a messed up guy. Now that was in the early 80s, but that was because, again, these missing persons cases were kind of carrying on into the 80s. And you had, cases like Sherry Irely and the others that they kind of sat there for a while unsolved, and they were kind of added to the bunch. And fortunately, at least justice was served. And, I know for some people that's enough. And for me, I'm obviously happy, or maybe not happy, but relieved is maybe the better word, when, the people responsible for crimes like this are, if they've been on the run for a while, finally apprehended and identified for what they did. Sometimes it takes 30, 40 years, and by the time they find the people responsible, they're elderly. Look at the Golden State Killer. Guy looked like he was 120 by the time he was found. So it's there and it's good. But I feel like now, of course, I've never experienced that. I experienced the loss of my cousin who was shot dead, but that wasn't an unsolved mystery. That wasn't, as far as I'm concerned, cold-blooded murder. I know there's some people in my family that would say otherwise, but I was also a little kid and, didn't really understand fully the finality, that's the right term to use, of, death. So the one real serious instance of that I faced in my life, when it happened, I was too young to understand it. It really took till I was like in college before I really started reflecting on that and kind of putting together the effects that had on me that kind of laid dormant in my soul for a very long time. So I can't speak for being like an adult and being able to, having a better capability of processing and trying to live with something like that over time as an adult. I don't know if I'd really be all that satisfied or that I would feel all that much better if the perpetrator was finally apprehended. If someone who killed like my cousin or something like that. Now, if it was my girlfriend, that would be that'd be a whole other ball of wax. I'd be out looking for that guy myself, and I probably wouldn't wait for the police to show up before I'd serve my own justice. That is under the extreme circumstances of like if, God forbid, someone ever killed the one that I love. And I think I even talked about that a little bit in my first recording where I discussed like, I don't really know. If somebody killed the one that I love, I don't know if I fully understand why people take justice into their own hands. And I can't guarantee that under the circumstances I wouldn't do the same. It's hard. I tend to surprise myself a lot. I tend to think, I would never do that, or I would definitely do that. And then when the situation comes, I end up doing the opposite. So, again, it kind of lingers out there. I really don't know what I would do. I don't know if I would just let the police do their work, try to let justice prevail. I don't know. I'm also very big on, like, you don't take somebody else's life. I mean, somebody who's never done anything to you, So my attitude is, you try to take my life, and I'll have to defend myself, and I may defend myself to the point where I end up having to kill you. And that's on you. You tried to take my life. You signed up for that. The moment you decided you were going to put my life in danger, you forced me, and I think a lot of people would understand that, into a position where I have to protect myself. And if protecting my life means having to take yours, then that's the unfortunate set of circumstances put forth. But again, you forced me into that situation, fella. Man, this is getting dark. Anyway, I just don't know how I'd feel. But yeah, I've covered, and there's some cases that I haven't done videos on because there's literally so little information. Like, I don't even know if I'd be able to stretch a 10-minute video out of it. And where the evidence or the information that is known is so sparse that you can't even really, like, I'm sure the police have more, but the stuff that's readily available to the public, like, there's almost not enough there for you to even really theorize on what happened. I mean, you can theorize, but really, what theory isn't going to work when you have so little information? It'll just be like, so-and-so was, like, I know that there was a case of a young woman who went to a party. This was in the early 70s, because I know she's one of these cases that people have, it's at least kind of come up for suggestion. May have been like a Ted Bundy victim, just because she disappeared at a time where Ted Bundy was free and living in the Pacific Northwest. I can't remember her name. But she kind of fit into this succession of crimes because she went to a party in Sheridan, I want to say, which is a town just east of Salem. And yeah, it was like she went to the party, she left the party, was never seen again. And that's really all that's known. So it's like, how do you even try to resolve that? I haven't even been able to find information like, did she have like a jealous boyfriend? Was there anybody that had any reason to go after her? Do we have reason to believe she was a victim of circumstance? Some hitchhiker flagged her down on the way home and then killed her. I would assume if she, when she left, did someone pick her up, or did she drive herself? What if she did drive herself? Was her car ever found? Like, so much information that's just not available. There's cases like that, like, it's like, they're almost only worth covering in a video for the sake of, giving them a name again, which, I mean, usually is more than enough for me. I've contemplated doing, like, a mystery murder series episode or two that's, like, not one long case, but just a mention of these small cases like that there's, like, no information about. And, kind of cover, like, 3 cases in one episode. Because each one ain't going to account for much. And yeah, that's an element that I didn't even really address all that much, except for like 2 cases really, is the whole Ted Bundy angle. Because there's these victims that disappeared in the early 70s, or not disappeared, but, turned up dead, and we don't know who was responsible, or just disappeared. There's this string of cases from the early 70s, and then there's the cases from a little later on, when someone like Ted Bundy was either incarcerated, or if he was free, he wasn't known to be in the Pacific Northwest area, much less Oregon. And, because again, it's really convenient, and I mean, it's something that needs to be assessed, obviously, but it's kind of always been a matter of convenience that when there's a lot of unsolved murder cases, we try to think, okay, what serial killer was working during that time? Can we, nab them for any of those? And I know that once Ted Bundy was kind of out of the picture and these more late 70s murders were happening, and even some into the early 80s, people started talking about the Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway, even though some of these cases happened 4 or 5 years before he was ever known to have killed. And granted, very rarely is, especially if you're a prolific serial killer who's killed like 30, 40, 50 people or more, very rarely is the like first known victim of that killer their actual first victim. It's just, as much as we know, it's the starting point for us. In terms of what we know, it's likely that Ted Bundy, I wouldn't be surprised, was it Linda Ann Healy is regarded as Bundy's first victim, and I think he killed her, was it February of 74? Again, I have a lot of information I'm trying to pull out of my head right now, so if I'm not certain, I'm going to come out and say it. Like, I want to say it was during that time. It was like start of February of 74. But I bet to that point, Ted Bundy had at least killed a handful of people. And one of the he essentially said, as I understand it, he said that he had killed 3 women in Oregon. But only one of those has been identified. So there's, this theorization going around, well, who are the other 2 women? Because apparently he never said, or he never asked their name, never got it, or just didn't want to say their name. So there's just been a lot of theorization. Who are these other 2 women? And, of course, I'll never say, like, well, I know. I guarantee you it's these 2. Because there's really 3 women that I most feel could have been Bundy victims. And I've covered all 3 of them in mystery murder episodes. One is Rita Lorraine Jolly, who, in my video, I actually was pretty quick to dismiss Jolly as being a Bundy victim. And I feel like she's still, of these 3, she's the least likely to have been a Bundy victim. But when you're in, when you're in 3rd place as a possible victim of a serial killer, there's still definite possibilities. And one of the main reasons I dismissed it, which I think was actually kind of a very stupid and kind of short-sighted reason, was because Rita Lorraine Jolly lived in West Lynn. And it always seemed to me, because we know that Ted Bundy actually did multiple trips kind of up and down the West Coast, but it seemed like he would stick to I-5, or, maybe if you want to go the coastal route, take Highway 101 for part of that. So Rita Lorraine Jolly lived more to the east of there, but she actually lived very close to I-205, and I-205 had actually, I think, only that stretch had only been recently. It had only been completed for a couple of years. I'd have to look back because I remember looking up actually, I could look it up right now. I'm recording this on my phone, but you can access other stuff. Because I know that I-205, which runs from Washington down into almost to Wilsonville, I know that one part of it was completed first and the other part was completed later. Because that would make it, because if Ted Bundy's coming from the south, or from the north, he's not going to turn off on a 205. Because 205 technically started in Gladstone initially. I'm pulling up information. Construction began in 1967. So by 1972, it stretched from so it's Tualatin where it ends, to Gladstone, which Gladstone is right across the river from West Lynn. So she would have been, Rita Lorraine Jolly would have kind of lived near there. But yeah, it actually looks like it was almost the early 80s before the 205 as we know it was completed. So that, because it just seems like that's a little bit off the beaten path for Ted Bundy. He would have had to go several miles. He'd be going down I-5. He'd have to go several miles east on a whim. Because when Rita Lorraine Jolly went missing, the freeway only went to Gladstone. So it began several miles east of I-5. So unless he was... Now, it could be that Bundy was in the area and maybe he was heading back north and decided to get onto 205 from its southern origin. And was coming up through that area. Because the reason I delve into the whole freeway element of things is because Rita Lorraine Jolly was last seen walking along Sunset Avenue, which ends like right next, just north of I-205. So then, the question can become, was Bundy perchance on that freeway at that time? Maybe he came up from the Tualatin side. Maybe he was heading back north, kind of heading back to Seattle. And he happened upon Jolly, who was out walking by herself. Now, something that I covered in the video was that she'd had a leg injury that it was kind of built up in the newspaper articles I found. I even think like the general cold case statement on her for Clackamas County mentioned that she was like walking with a limp from it, which kind of created this idea of, then she'd be a perfect potential target or a person of opportunity because, hey, maybe this person can't run away. But of all people in the world, Rita Lorraine Jolly's sister actually commented on my video and was happy I was covering it, added a few more details to the story. But one thing she clarified was that her limp was it was over-exaggerated, what they were saying, and that the limp she had was barely noticeable, that she was not, like, hobbling along, which makes sense in hindsight because, she was going out for, like, an evening walk by herself, and you think, like, if your leg's so messed up that you're having to, like, hobble along, you probably wouldn't have even if you're like a really want-to-be active person, you're probably not going to go on, a long walk if your leg's that messed up. So that actually made sense in hindsight. Hindsight. And then there was another video I did more recently because there was two other people, and these are the two that I most feel personally. Obviously, can't prove it, but looking at, a lot of the people that they think are possibilities, I feel like the two most possible and likely victims of Bundy are a woman named Suzanne Justice, who was from Eugene, and Vicky Hillar, who lived in Eugene. In the case of Suzanne Justice, I want to say it was November of, I can't remember if it was 72 or 73. Again, little detail, there's so much information. But it was at a time where Bundy was out free, living in the Pacific Northwest, and could have been responsible. Suzanne Justice was up in Portland. She was last heard from when she called her mother from a phone booth next to the Memorial Coliseum in the Rose Quarter area, where the Moda Center is now. It's the Lloyd District. Kind of a sketchy area now. It's always been kind of sketchy. So, perhaps some local in the area could have been responsible. But after Suzanne made that call to her mother, she said she was going to come home the next day. Her mom got her a hotel room to stay in for the night, but Suzanne never showed at that hotel. That was the last time she was seen or heard from again. And Suzanne had the perfect appearance. They always talk about Ted Bundy liked his victims. They were usually like brunettes with their hair parted in the middle. And that was pretty much how Suzanne looked at that time. And she was in her early 20s. She had the perfect look of a Bundy victim. And she was at the Memorial Coliseum. I-5 goes right by the Memorial Coliseum. It literally borders the Moda Center pretty much on its east side. It goes right through there. And Ted Bundy was, again, known to have made trips up and down, and I-5 probably would have been one of his preferred routes. I can't say for certain, but that's what makes sense. But what really got me the most, and again, I know I'm talking about, not Portland, but I'm getting into that realm, because I'm sure there was a lot of these victims in the early 70s that people contemplate, was Ted Bundy responsible for those? And a lot of ones are mentioned at times where Ted Bundy was like already in jail. So kind of crappy research on those parts. But I found like a file that they pretty much took down all of Ted Bundy's like known actions during this period of time. Pretty much any time they could place him in a certain location, they would mark it. So there was a lot of references. It was primarily references to him going to the gas station, which means he went to a gas station, put gas in his Volkswagen, and paid with a card. Because if you just hand someone cash, how is someone going to know that you were there? It's the card transaction and having that on record that lets them know he was at a gas station in this town at this time or whatever. So that doesn't compensate, obviously, for when you pay for gas with cash. So it wouldn't surprise me if Ted Bundy was going to go on a little excursion into Oregon and get a victim. He'd make sure right before he left Seattle to get some gas and pay with his card and show, hey, I just got gas for my bug. And using the card to make sure that transaction would have, kind of an official documentation with it. And then as he travels off to wherever he's going to go, he starts buying gas with cash. And that way, can't necessarily, obviously, if they knew the exact bills that he had used, they could, who would go through that much? Who would know what specific bills he had? The best way to find out he was at a gas station where he paid with cash is if whoever, was at the station would somehow remember him specifically. So he could have gone down into Oregon and, because I looked up about how far he could travel on a full tank of gas. And I don't even think he could make it from Seattle to Eugene, really. If he could make it that far, he wouldn't be able to make it back home, so he would have had to get gas at another time. But what I'm getting at is one of the other things they also show on there is when he was in class, because he was going to college at this time. I think he was going to Puget Sound at this time. And so it marked whenever he was in class. It seemed like he usually was a Monday, Wednesday, Friday student. Because from pretty much the beginning of September, every week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, at least, it would say he was at school. And, usually the only time you get off for school is, obviously in between terms, but maybe like Thanksgiving. You have a day or two off, and then you get off a little bit before Christmas. You get to enjoy your Christmas break, and then you're back at school like start of January. There's no big holiday or big hullabaloo going on at the start of November. And yet, start of November, the week where Suzanne Justice disappeared, is the only week between like early September and early December where all of a sudden Ted Bundy is not at school all week. Now, maybe there's an explanation for that, and maybe there was a reason for that, but I'm just saying that all of a sudden there's a period of time where his whereabouts are much less accounted for. And the last, I think he was, he'd put gas in his car at a gas station in Seattle the morning, or early in the day, the day that Susanna Justice made her call. So that pretty much the same day that she was last heard from. And then I think it was it was at least a day and a half after that before, Bundy's whereabouts were known of again, and he's back in Seattle. But again, he fills up his bug in Seattle. It only takes a couple hours to get from Seattle to Portland. So to say, oh, well, here's this documentation that shows that he got gas that day and he was in Seattle, so how could he have been in Portland? Well, Seattle and Portland are not that far apart. Even a trip from Seattle to Eugene is not super long, as long as you're not stopping for a bunch of reasons. So he just happened to be out of school, and his whereabouts were a little less known, right around the day that Suzanne Justice disappeared. So I have lots of reasons to believe that she was a victim of his, but the one that I most believe was a victim of his is what is still regarded as an unsolved murder out of Eugene, which is Vicky Hillar. During the summer, I want to say of 1973, Vicky Hillar had recently graduated from college in Illinois. She'd relocated to Eugene. I don't think she'd been living there for too long. And one day she left work. One of her coworkers saw her get into her car. She was going to go home and get ready for a party that she was going to go to later. The distance from her workplace to her home, I think it was like 9/10 of a mile or something. It was very close. It's almost a straight line. And yet, for whatever reason, it appears Vicky never made it home. She just vanished. She's never been seen since. Her car's never been seen since. And the thing about Eugene is, on almost all sides, especially to the west and to the east, there's a lot of rugged land, hills, forested areas, a lot of area that is kind of not habited. I don't know. You know what I'm saying. A lot of area where nobody's there and people don't really have any incentive to go there. There's so many endless square miles of land just outside of Eugene that one could ditch a body, ditch a car, and it might never get found because it's just off the radar. Now, those are the ones that I think Ted Bundy is most likely responsible for, but there were, other people that were turning up dead or disappearing in those early 70s that people contemplated. Maybe Bundy's responsible. I know there's a woman, I think Alma Jean Barrow was her name. She disappeared from Portland, and I don't think she's ever been seen since, but she was also hanging out at the New Copper Penny, which is a real sketchy dive bar in southeast Portland, and she was seen leaving with a random guy. So I think it's more likely that guy that she left with, who wasn't Ted Bundy, was probably responsible, most likely, for why she disappeared. But the preponderance of the cases that interest me the most were cases that happened after Bundy was either not in the Pacific Northwest anymore, or he was in jail. Because he actually spent a considerable time in jail in the mid-70s. And even once he escaped from jail in Colorado, he immediately fled east. So pretty much after late 1974, there's not really a whole lot of reason to think he was spending a lot of time in the Pacific Northwest. And his only known victim was a woman. God, now I can see her face, but I can't remember her name all of a sudden. Kathleen Parks. Or wasn't Roberta Kathleen Parks? God, that was going to make me real sad if I couldn't remember the one that we actually know is a victim of him. And she did reside in that kind of Corvallis, Salem area, because she disappeared, or she was a Oregon State University student in Corvallis when Bundy got to her. And, as I started looking into more cases in the mid-70s, I would glance back at Bundy and realize, the time in which he killed in the Pacific Northwest was really not that long, at least from the moment that we know officially he started killing. It was only a couple months, really, before he left, headed on down to Utah, and later was apprehended for what he was doing down there. But yeah, there was another crime. I can't remember the woman's. It was a video I did 3 years ago, but there was a woman living kind of in that middle Willamette Valley area who turned up dead, and she was still young. She'd been a University of Oregon student. In fact, I think they created a scholarship in her name after she had died, and it was one of those stories. Some local creep got fixated on her, and he started frequently kind of stalking her without her really knowing, and he would show up and peer into her windows at night. And the guy even said, because the guy actually wasn't caught for almost a decade. So it fit right into that dynamic where for the most of the 70s it was an unsolved crime, and then they finally apprehended the guy doing something else, and were ultimately able. Owens was her last name. I can't remember her first name. Something Owens. At least I got that part. But yeah, and a lot of these creepers, eventually stalking and looking in her window and stuff wasn't enough anymore. And one night he, after she'd gone to bed, he crept into her home and held her down and brutally murdered her. And it was one of those things where he was kind of I was just doing stuff to her and I didn't know I was going to kill her, and then all of a sudden she's dead. I seldom believe a perpetrator when that happens. But yeah, that was a case I covered. One of the interesting elements of that was the guy that was responsible said that he was kind of, which actually makes sense when you think about the fact that this guy was kind of staring at this woman through her windows and kind of ogling her before he suddenly just went the next step and ended up killing her. He said that he really liked the movie Psycho, and that movie was a potential influence in what he did, because there's, the whole, everybody, even if you haven't seen the movie, you kind of know the general details of Janet Leigh's character, Marion Crane, kind of splitting from Phoenix with some money, and it's night and it's raining, and she decides to stop off at the first motel she sees, which is the Bates Motel, where Norman Bates and his, quote, mom lives. And before the, iconic shower scene, he takes this picture off of a wall and peers through this old hole, and he stares through that hole into Marion's room and watches her as she's undressing, which kind of explains why he specifically gave her that room, so that he could do that. So there's kind of a correlation between Norman Bates and this one other guy. So that was a story I covered that was from that area. I want to say it happened in Salem, but it's been so long, I could be totally wrong about that. And again, the cases that really stay with me the most are the ones that happened more in the later 70s. And part of that could be that there's more information available about some of them. I was able to delve into them more and really feel a little bit more of a connection than, I mean, again, some of these earlier 70s stories, even instances where people think Ted Bundy may have been involved, is minimal information. Like, I know there was, like, 2 teenage girls. There was, like, 8 or 10 random other cases of people disappearing. But, yeah, I know there was 2 teenage girls that disappeared from a small town near Eugene. God, I can't. Jeez, I'll tell you what, this fibromyalgia is killing my brain. I swear, I'm forgetting random stuff all the time. It's a small town just south, and I've always loved the name of the town, but I can't remember it. Anyway, 2 girls apparently were going to run away from home, and then disappeared. Maybe they did just successfully run away from home, but because they were teenagers, and a lot of teenagers say they're going to run away and end up coming back after a couple of days, it's kind of this lingering unsolved mystery what happened to those 2 girls. I remember there was another story that they're pretty sure was not Bundy. There was a woman who went to, I think it was in Sweet Home. It was one of those towns east of Salem. A woman, early 1970s, went into a supermarket, left the supermarket, and, never seen alive again. But apparently she had a very violent, abusive husband, and a lot of people think he was responsible for that killing, which I know that kind of became a place of contention for another unsolved murder that I've covered that happened in Eugene. Where there was a woman who was found, she was a University of Oregon student, Janet Shanahan, found dead in the trunk of her car after she'd been missing for like a day and a half. She last was seen hanging out with family members, and then she never made it home. And people noted that, she'd been killed, but in being placed in her trunk, it looked like whoever did it was very delicate. Like, they felt some connection to the person, some personal connection to the person, or maybe felt some guilt for what they did, so they wanted to at least leave her. And, they didn't want to just, leave her just splayed out in the middle of the street or something like that. And it never really came up as a possibility in the article, newspaper articles and coverage that was done in the immediate aftermath of that event. This happened in 1969. But I know that in the years to follow, the guy that she had just recently married came under suspicion. He apparently just wasn't really that invested in trying to find out who was responsible for, killing his new wife, and this killer who's roaming free. And I'm just like, that's never made sense to me. And in addition to that, her new husband apparently left town shortly after and relocated to somewhere on the East Coast. So got pretty far away from Oregon. And the unfortunate fact is, guilty or innocent, if you leave town not that long after your wife, girlfriend, what have you, dies, and we don't really know who did it, and the investigation's ongoing, and there's not really answers, and you just kind of leave town and just kind of wash your hands of it, you're going to look suspicious if you do that, regardless of what the reason is. And I know I found an article about kind of reflecting back on this, but it was from the late 90s. I want to say 97, 98, somewhere in there. It was about almost 30 years later. And the writer had gotten in contact with the husband and wanted to kind of discuss things with him. Apparently the husband was fairly cordial and forthcoming at first, and then just flipped. Lawyered up, said, "Don't ever talk to me again, don't bother me," completely shut down. So, those actions leave you to wonder, was he responsible for his new bride's death? What were the circumstances that would bring that about? They were both young. They'd just been married. As far as I know, Janet Shanahan wasn't from a super rich family that he would want to fake a kidnapping and get a ransom for, some crazy stuff like that. I don't know. Maybe the guy had rage issues. Again, if he was responsible, I don't know. There was just reason to believe. But there's probably some cases that, again, I would like to do an episode on in the future. I know there was one case of a woman during the 70s. Found, again, just scant smattering of newspaper articles, all of which didn't have a lot of information to them. And the woman, I just remember her last name was Bowe, Bowe. And I believe that it was another crime that happened like in the Salem, Corvallis area and never really got solved, I don't think. But I don't really know much information about that because I haven't, I say I want to do a video about it, which means in the future I'll take some notes on it and see if it's worth it. And if not, I can fit it into one of those smaller, multifaceted episodes where I address cases where there's not a whole lot of information that is known. But really, I'd say as far as I can remember off the top of my head, there's really 4 distinct cases, which actually 2 of them are likely connected. So in some cases you could say 4, and some you might say 3. That occurred during this time. One of them, people are pretty certain they know who was responsible. But it has not been fully proven. And this was a case, this happened in the late 70s, I want to say in 78, where 2 girls from the Salem Corvallis area went missing. First, there was a girl named Ann Ellenwood. Teenager, she was doing a walkathon with some friends. She separated from them briefly with the obvious intent to meet up with them later, and she just disappeared. And it was reported that people saw her talking to a guy who was driving a truck. The guy had kind of long, shaggy, blonde hair, at least to where it hung down like over his eyes. Not super long, but like almost shoulder length. So people became pretty convinced pretty early on, whoever this guy was, he was probably responsible. And just a short while later, another girl named Stephanie Ann Newsom disappeared. She had left her home and, just vanished. And what's interesting is both girls at some point in their life had done like paper delivery type, paper boy type work, or I guess in this case, paper girl type work. I don't know. I doubt there was a correlation there. I just found it interesting that both of them had that connection. But yeah, Stephanie Ann Newsom then vanished shortly after. And a little further on down the line, her remains were found. She was found dead. She'd been abandoned, kind of a rural area in an open field off of a main road through this kind of rural area. But Ann Ellenwood's remains have never been found, as far as I've heard, unless that's a recent discovery that's happened. I would, wouldn't be happy about that, but I'd be, relieved. Your happiness is, hey, the murder never happened in the first place. But people became pretty convinced pretty quickly. Whoever took Ann Ellenwood took Stephanie Ann Newsom. There were 2 girls about the same age, from the same general area, kidnapped within close proximity, time-wise, of each other. And, it's one of these cases that I don't know if they've officially said, like, you know what, this one's solved. We're going to say it's been solved. But the attitude has generally been that this has been solved. So there was a guy whose last name was Chambers, who lived kind of off in the Sweet Home area. And I've been through the Lebanon Sweet Home area, and if you live in that area, I don't mean to pass judgment, but the Lebanon Sweet Home area is just weird. I've only been through there a few times, so maybe I just was there at the worst possible moments, and things look worse than they seem. But every time I've gone through that area, I feel like I'm going to get sniped by a redneck. I remember my cross-country team, I think I maybe even mentioned it in the video I did on this matter and talking about Chambers being from this area. Mind you, this is, we're talking about something that happened in the late 70s, and I'm talking about something that happened in like 2003, but we had a cross-country invitational meet that was called the Sweet Home Invitational, and we ran at this park just outside of town. And when we were done, when your race is over, you want to cool down, keep moving, and you're already used to going long distances, so we would kind of just wander around when our part of the meet was over, and we all walked down to, I don't remember if it was a river or a creek, whatever body of water was next to the park, and we found like a loaded shotgun and just ammo scattered on the beach. That's like one of my standout stories from that area. And just some weird stories. I almost kind of want to delve into like the weird stuff, kind of weird crimes, murders that have happened out in that area. I also really want to do something. I did a video recently about the unsolved Crater Lake murders that happened back in the early 50s. I want to do another. I've never been. I've been in Oregonia my whole life. I've never been to Crater Lake. I've driven within like 40 miles of it, probably 60, 70 times in my life. But I've never actually been there. And I really want to go there at some point. But I want to do a video about kind of all the strangeness that happens there too. But anyway, this Chambers guy lived in this kind of weird Sweet Home Lebanon area. It's more Sweet Home that weirds me out than Lebanon, but they're both a little sketchy to me in their own right. And a lot of attention became focused on this guy. I think it was known, at least in the case of Ann Ellenwood, that he'd been in that area, like right near where this walkathon was going on. And what was particularly interesting is when authorities got to him, he had short, dark hair, recently cut. It was learned that he had just, recently cut his hair, and that his hair before then was blonde and it was shaggy. And he drove this truck. Everything about his appearance before he suddenly decided to get a trim and completely, he had a kind of a bushy blonde beard. He'd clean shaved his face. This guy went out of his way to like you see a picture of him before and after, and they don't even remotely look like the same person. So conveniently, right after, Ann Ellenwood and Stephanie Ann Newsom go missing, this guy who looks exactly like the guy that Ann Ellenwood is last seen talking to completely changes his appearance. And his truck matched perfectly. Like, everything synced up. And I think what solidified it even more for a lot of people is when the heat started coming down on this guy. He hadn't been arrested or anything like that yet, but they were looking into him. They were looking real close at him. And it seemed like getting arrested was kind of the next step. It was kind of looming around the corner. Chambers got into his car, drove off down like an old logging road, kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and killed himself. And friends of his who, you want to defend your friends, and if you're really close with someone, there's going to be an element of cognitive dissonance there where you can't allow yourself to believe that he's the one guilty of such disturbing crimes. So I know people close to him said the reason he killed himself was because he couldn't, handle the harassment that was happening of him. And I'm like, give me a break. I mean, unless this guy was the most fragile child that's ever existed. Like, come on. It's very damaging that he I know this is not the most sensitive way to put it, but this guy probably killed 2 innocent girls, but it's regarded as taking the easy way out, not facing responsibility for what you did. And I don't know if there was any history this guy had of depression or anything that might trigger him to do something like that. And there was a very similar situation that happened. And I think this is more interconnected with the William Scott Smith drama. There was a little girl named Danielle Good who disappeared from her home and was later found dead. Very tragic. I think she was only like 8 or 9 years old. And it was happening around the time these other crimes were happening. And it was kind of thought whoever was responsible for these other crimes was probably also responsible for that, even though these other victims were like more in like their 20s, whereas this was like a little girl. And usually if you got a serial offender going out, they're not going to diverge too much in terms of whether they're targeting adults or kids. But I know Danielle Good had, I believe it was her uncle, who apparently had a little bit of a troubling, erratic past. And kind of like this situation in this case, he, not too long after Danielle Good vanished and was killed, he also committed suicide. And a lot of people kind of felt that was probably either out of guilt or as a way to avoid what he felt was the inevitable justice that was going to befall him, or maybe a combination of the two. So that's another case that technically I think is still unsolved, but people are pretty confident that it was probably this uncle that was responsible, unfortunately. Well, and also I want to say Danielle Good was like abducted from inside her own home in the middle of the night, which is very brazen. You'd think she would struggle and try to scream, but if she saw someone like her uncle, who she would probably recognize and you'd think not be afraid of, if he shows up at night and lures her out, she might be quiet about it, and that might explain how she was taken from her own home without waking anybody up or without any sounds or signs of a struggle or anything like that. So the Ellenwood Newsom cases, one of those cases that people are pretty confident they know who was responsible. And I just kind of glossed over. I'm sure there was other details, because I'm pretty sure they searched Chambers' truck and all that and found like little pieces of evidence that suggested he was tied to these crimes. But he took his life before he could be apprehended and, speak on the situation or be taken to justice or any of that stuff. And I did a video about that several years ago, and I kind of forgot about it, and it kind of sat there on my computer, and then I stumbled onto it, and I was like, wait, I never posted this. So even though I did it way earlier, because of its status, and it's still technically not full, you can't say for an absolute 100% certainty that Chambers was guilty, but you kind of feel confident saying you're like 97%. But I don't think any DNA has been used maybe it has recently since I've looked into the case. But as far as I know, I don't think there hasn't been any DNA that's proven he was responsible for this or that. So I include it in my mystery murder series, even though I did. And if you watch you'll notice I have the same intro for every episode except that one, because I did it years earlier before I was even doing a mystery murder series. So that was a pretty significant one that kind of stayed with me during that time. And then one case it was another one of these cases where I'd stumble onto a few newspaper articles about it and kind of be like, maybe someday I'll talk about this one too. And I didn't really dive into it that much, so I didn't really notice initially until I decided to actually make the episode how intriguing and bizarre this case was. So I ended up doing I think over an hour-long mystery murder episode on this because it was so intriguing to me. And that is the death of a woman named Jean Marie Peters, who lived in Salem with her husband, and they actually maintained a couple of apartments in town. And there was one particular apartment, I want to say it was called the Madrona, something along those lines. And there were, as happens, there was at least a unit available to rent. And apparently somebody had gotten in contact with Jean without her husband being involved, even though they both ran these apartments together, someone seemed to get in touch with Jean alone and wanted to see her about possibly taking this vacant unit. So she goes to the door and leaves, and her husband's like, well, where are you going? And she's like, oh, somebody wants to check out the unit that we have available. And the husband, he didn't know anything about it till that point. He was like dumbfounded. And I know a lot of times where someone dies and they're married, one of the first things you want to do is look into the husband. In examination of this situation, I feel like there's about as little reason as you can have to think that Jean Peters' husband was responsible, that you could find in pretty much any case. First of all, the way things went down, it would have been an extremely stupid way for this guy to take out his own wife, because as you've probably gathered, whoever Jean had spoken to, and unfortunately she never gave a name to her husband and as to who this person was that was going to meet her at the complex, and whoever was going to meet her may have given her a fake name anyway. But this individual was just trying to lure her there, and when she showed up and they went into the apartment together, this guy murdered Jean Peters, and she put up an incredible struggle. They said there was just blood marks and scuffs and all this stuff all over the apartment. Like, she was trying to fight and run and get away, and she probably almost did. Probably came as close as someone could who, isn't expecting when they show up under these circumstances that in a minute or two they're going to be fighting for their life. But in the end, the attacker won out, brutally killed her, and some people in the apartment complex noticed a car parked there that left shortly after Jean had showed up, and that was probably the individual responsible. But the idea that, the husband would lure his own wife to an apartment that they run, they're the landlords, meaning everybody there knows them, at least to some degree. And even when Marie didn't come home right away, her husband contacted someone who lived in those apartments that they were friends with. So they were actually close friends with at least a couple people that lived there. So why would this husband lure his wife to an apartment where people know them directly and can identify them to murder his wife? People would see him showing up. If they didn't show up together, they would at least see them showing up at close to the same time. And then suddenly his wife turns up dead and the husband doesn't know what happened. It'd be one of the dumbest things in the world, one of the dumbest ways to kill your own wife. So I really don't think the husband was responsible, even though that's often the case in these cases. And so it's another case that looms in mystery. To this day, nobody knows who lured Jean Peters there. And a lot of these cases have had their share of, you get hundreds of leads, maybe thousands of leads. And then there's always like 3 that become of real interest, but there's either not enough to get them on, or they eventually find out they have some kind of alibi, even sometimes those alibis are kind of shaky. But people will still get dismissed. But a lot of times it's a lot of leads for little to no success, unfortunately. And that's been the situation with that case. This guy, presumably pulled up in this car, got in and sped away. It's a pretty brazen assault. There was that street was lined with apartments, lots of people, broad daylight. And, this guy meets her, he meets her at the apartment complex. He's risking being seen in the area. He's risking being seen going in with her, leaving without her, all these possibilities. So it's really kind of dumb luck, or at least an unlikely situation that turned out to be true, where this guy was able to do this and escape without someone being able to definitively identify the guy. Again, I think 1 or 2 people caught a brief glimpse of this guy, in his car. And I don't even know, you can't say it seems pretty likely, but you can't even say for absolute certainty that the guy in the car and the guy that killed her are one and the same. So that's another case from that period, which I think that one was also 1978. And just nobody knows what happened. But the circumstances are just really intriguing to me. The being lured to your own property. They ran this place, and being taken out that way. It does kind of harken back a bit to the Dark Strangler, who was this guy named Earl Leonard Nelson, who in the late 20s killed at least that are known, I think 27, 28 women. Probably killed scores more. And he killed at least 4 women that are known of in the Portland area. And I don't know if he maintained this modus operandi for every woman he went after, because he killed all over the country. I even think he had a couple victims in Canada, which he was actually ultimately apprehended in Canada. But the women that he killed in Portland, he pretty much used the same setup, the same situation. Was he found women who owned or were renting out a property, usually a house, where there weren't other units connected to it, other people potentially around. And he would, ingratiate himself to them and express interest and say, hey, can we meet up and you can show me around the property? And he would show up, meet the woman, they would go inside, and he would come out and they wouldn't. And the women would be found dead, ultimately. And it's interesting because if I'm remembering things correctly, the way that the women ended up dead, or at least where they were found, kind of fluctuated. I know one was found in her attic. Some were just kind of found the moment you'd walk into the house. But yeah, this guy used kind of that same method that Earl Leonard Nelson used, utilizing it 50 years later to lure someone. And it's so risky, because not just what I mentioned before in terms of, being seen. You're at an apartment. There's other apartments around, but also this individual had to get in touch, had to contact. There had to be all this groundwork. And again, a lot of luck. He has to find out that this place is available. He has to know that she's available or that she's connected to that property. And whoever's contacting her about it is lucky enough that, again, her husband never got involved. Her husband never even knew about this. And you'd think with them both running the place, the husband would have at least heard about this at some point or another. That, too, is also risky. And I think in the aftermath, law enforcement kind of theorized that whoever was responsible for this was probably utilizing this same system with other women, and maybe some other women were turning up dead under similar circumstances. It's hard to say, because you don't know if this guy stayed in that general area, or if maybe he was one of those guys that traveled around, and he kind of killed from state to state. That's what Earl Leonard Nelson did. Wherever he found himself, he was just killing people there. So I know that it was kind of theorized that this was maybe a serial offender, and that maybe, if not other women turning up dead, there may have been other women that survived near attacks of this nature. They just got lucky. It's hard to say, because we don't know who the guy is, but I know that it might be interesting. I know I didn't do this I think I did a brief kind of, general newspaper search to see if there were any instances similar to Gene Peters' murder around that same time, and I didn't really find anything. Perhaps a deeper search effort might unveil other women kind of in the same area that maybe experienced similar things, and that these may have been the workings of the same individual. But I mean, if you bust a guy for nearly doing something similar to another woman, you have him identified, then you can start looking into, well, what was this guy doing the day that Jean Marie Peters died. Was he in that area? Does he have an alibi? All those questions start to roll out. So I feel like that might, you need almost a stroke of luck. That might almost be the easiest way to hopefully find a resolution to this case. Because again, these unsolved cases, they're cases from the 70s. Like, they're getting pretty old, but they're not so old that there's no hope. I've covered cases from, end of the 1800s that have never been solved, that aren't ever. I know there's a guy, I think his name was William Barber, who was visiting Portland on business like around 1890, it may have been 1889, and his body turned up in the Willamette River in Portland. Nobody has any idea necessarily who he was last seen with. He'd recently arrived in town, and suddenly his body turned up dead in the Willamette, and he'd been shot. So he didn't fall in the river by accident. This was a killing. And I've stumbled onto a few of those. Some unsolved murders where we don't even know the victim. The victim's never even been identified. There was a case from 1900 also in Portland where a guy was pulled out of the Willamette River, and he'd been tied down to, try to make his body sink to the bottom. He'd been tied up with like a brake from one of the trains in the rail yard nearby. And they said that those like train brakes are like 50 pounds, like something super heavy. But still the body managed to come ashore, and as far as I could gather, they never identified who that guy was. But yeah, I mean, if somehow someone was to connect the dots there, maybe I'm just the man for the job. Similar other instances that were going on at that time, and that person's identified, maybe that can bring new life to this kind of forgotten case. Because I know, I read, because there was another case, again, sorry, I'm straying over to Portland a lot, but I'm correlating a lot of stuff at the same time. There was a woman named Camille Foch, I think Foch was her last name, who worked at the Washington Square Mall back in the 1970s. And when she left to go to her car after getting off of work, someone ambushed her and shot her dead in her car. And it was another one of these cases where when I found it, there wasn't really a whole lot of information to be found. There was the little, piece they do for the county police, the county cold unit, what have you, where, they have like a small paragraph about the incident. And then, I think I found 2 or 3 newspaper articles. And I mean, I researched it and only found a couple. And then when I went back and checked again later, I found a lot more. And I do want to do a video in this series about that. But that is a case that I know there's kind of renewed hope that maybe something will happen in that case, because the county recently got like a whole bunch of money. I don't remember if it was like a federal grant or what, but they got a bunch of money to kind of pour into investigating these unsolved crimes that have happened in that county. So that gives that case, the chance, more. Now they have the money, they can like investigate this and maybe be fortunate enough to do some DNA testing and maybe find. I mean, there's so many. The fact that you can use DNA now to detect the ancestors or relatives of a guilty person, and that's how that's being used to identify people as killers. Like, that is insane that can happen now. But it can. So, you keep hope for these cases from the 1970s. They're not that old. And we've seen older cases solved. We've seen cases 80, 90 years old end up fortunately getting solved one day. And another case from this mix. Now, this goes back to 1970, so we're kind of backtracking slightly, but it was from Junction City, which is an area kind of between, it's a little north of Eugene, kind of between Eugene and Albany, real tiny, at least in terms of the area where there's actually streets and people actually live. It's a very small town, just kind of off the freeway. And it's another one of these stories that, like, I covered it in a Historic Murders of Portland episode. And it's another one of these situations where I'm kind of surprised. I'm really surprised. Now, this is a little bit different because it didn't happen in broad daylight. It did happen during the night. Most people in the area were asleep. But literally, the man that's believed responsible in this case was actually seen up close, almost face to face, by a neighbor that lived in the area. And this was the murder of the Dades. D-A-D-E. Dade. And of course, I remember the woman was named Julie. What was the husband's name? Oh, Lord help me. The Dades, though, they lived in Junction City. They'd recently had a baby. And they were living in an apartment there. And it's kind of a bizarre story. Because it seems Terry Dade. Sorry, I was looking it up as I was talking. So Julie and Terry Dade. Terry was the husband. It appears someone broke into their house. This is like middle of the night. Shot Terry dead in the house because he was later found dead there. The baby was left alone. Baby was okay. But whoever did this shot Terry and then abducted Julie from the apartment. And it's felt that as he tried to get Julie out of there and probably drag her down to a car or something along those lines, she broke free and she started running. And again, it's a small town. She started running and, screaming for help. And she got a couple of blocks before she was caught up to, presumably by the person responsible for killing her husband and coming after her. And as this guy was grabbing her and trying to pull her away, one of the neighbors came out. It was like, what the hell's going on? And the guy that grabbed her, gave him this, BS story. I don't remember the exact story. I don't remember if he said like, oh, she's just drunk, whatever. I really wish, it is what it is. I really wish this neighbor would have paid a little closer attention or taken a little bit more of an interest. Like, I think it comes down to just a lot of people just don't want to get involved. They don't want to get mixed up in stuff because then there's this added risk. And I get that as an introvert. I totally get that. It's just people just don't want to get mixed up in crap that, doesn't concern them. Because a number of times that I've read, in these cases where people turn up dead and their perpetrators are never found, or at least aren't discovered for years and they're cold cases till then. And there'll be these people that saw things that absolutely should have been 100% red flags, and they just kind of turned a nose up to it. Or, people would give them these stupid excuses for why, don't worry, nothing to see here. And people would just believe that and walk away. These dumb, ignorant, childish excuses a 5-year-old should be able to see through. And people just walk away. And I'm just like, again, maybe part of it is that I spend so much time researching this stuff and looking into these unsolved cases, and I see this stuff so much, and I have such a keen interest in it. And of course, I'm always out vlogging, but when I start seeing something that's even on the verge of being suspicious, something that looks like some guy's abducting someone's fighting something that could lead to something bad later on, I've already got my phone ready to start recording if I have to. I may stay out of the limelight, like stay hidden for a moment, but I'm there. Like, I'm paying attention. I'm invested. And if I stumble upon it and they tell me something, there's no big deal, don't worry about it, she's just drunk, whatever. Like, I'll be like, oh, okay, but then I'm gonna kind of stay in the area. And it seems like this neighbor, who again saw the guy, but he's never been identified, saw the guy, with this woman, and he dragged her off, and she's obviously struggling, probably begging for help. Like, why the F would you just automatically believe this guy? Like, if someone is actively calling out for help, like, you need to take that seriously. I don't care who you are. So, the big final a conclusion to this crazy story is just a short while later and close by, another neighbor right around the corner wakes up, and it's still, pretty early morning hours, wakes up to see that there's a car on fire under the carport in front of his house. So he doesn't know what the hell's going on, but he's got a fire. So he tries to, put it out. And when the fire's finally put out, Julie Dade's charred up body is discovered underneath the car. So whoever this is that, got to her, just a short while later, I don't know if they knocked her unconscious or what, but, put her body underneath a car and burned her. So just a brutal, one guy gets shot, the other one gets burned up. Just a brutal murder from 1970 that also has never been solved to this date. But it's one of these situations, just luck. This guy is seen, and they can't even fully determine who. I don't even know if they really knew what race the guy was, because it seemed the implication was he was a white guy, but then there was a Latino gentleman who would come through town just a little bit after and apparently went on this rampage. I don't think he killed anybody, but he kind of just went on this crazy rampage that made people think okay, well, he's in the Junction City area and he's going nuts. Maybe he's responsible. There was never anything to really tie him to the crime other than just the fact that this guy was acting strangely. But it's just not enough for a conviction. So that and then it's another interesting story. But the one that stays with me the most, the one I mentioned when I was kind of getting this thing started, the one that stayed with me the most, that I could find practically no information on other than some old newspaper articles, and half the Google results you look up are stuff I've done on it. And it stays with me, and it's kind of astonishing to me that it's loomed as such a forgotten case. No other local historian has written a blog about it. Nobody else has done a video about it. There's no just some resource from some website. There's just practically nothing out there. And it's such horrendously tragic, but also just an incredibly bewildering case. And I'm still not 100% certain that I'm even pronouncing her last name right. I typed it in on Google to try to have them pronounce it for me, and they pronounced her last name as Migis, which is spelled M-I-G-I-S, which to me is Migis. But I know sometimes names like that end with an S, they have an E sound. So maybe her last name could have been McGee. But I'm going with Migis because that's what Google told me. Her name was Tina Michelle Migis. She was a 17-year-old girl in 1975 and a frequent runaway. And near the start of October 1975, she had been missing from Portland, where she lived. And she was ultimately tracked down in Yreka, California, just about 20 miles south of the Oregon-California border. Oddly enough, the town that my mom grew up in, where my grandparents lived for 50 years until their passing. So she's finally found. She's a frequent runaway. I don't believe she wasn't living with her parents at that time. So she was kind of a situation that it was a different system than Child Protective Services like we have now, but it was kind of the 70s equivalent to that. It was kind of their responsibility to kind of, okay, we found this runaway, we got to get her home. Whereas today you'd take pretty serious, I would hope, pretty serious means to make sure that so-and-so, this kid, gets to where they're supposed to go. Back in 1975, they paid for a bus ticket for her. Said, get on this bus and come back home to Portland. Nobody traveled with her. Nobody monitored her. They just gave her a ticket, put her on a bus, and just assumed she'd go home willingly. That's the first element of this overall tragedy, because Tina Michelle Migis did not make it home. So Tina does get on the bus, rolling out of Yreka, heading north, ultimately supposed to take her home to Portland. But somewhere between Roseburg and Eugene, probably closer to Eugene, because that's where she's next seen. She gets off the bus, never to get back on. What did you expect to happen? Like, I don't know why they just assumed she would just voluntarily go back home. She'd been gone for like almost a month. So for whatever reason, it was obvious, it seemed at the time, she was not too keen on going back to whatever situation she had in Portland. I don't know fully what that situation consisted of, but whatever it is, she didn't want to be there. And what's really interesting is, she gets off the bus probably after, just a few hours. And she's last seen like almost 3 days later. So there's this, and it doesn't seem like anybody's ever really figured out what happened, but there's this 2.5 day period, something along those lines, maybe even closer to 3 days, where Tina has gotten off the bus and she's in this area somewhere between Roseburg and Eugene, but we don't know what happened, where she was, who she was with. It seemed like, there was reports that, she'd been staying with this guy in Wairika who she seemed to know. There was later reports that there was a guy in Salem that she'd stay with sometimes. And he was briefly, I think that place was briefly looked into. So it seemed like she kind of had places to stay at some of the places. I don't know if that applied to, like, Eugene or Roseburg. But whatever the case, there's a couple days here where we don't really know what she was doing. But she was staying around that area. And she's last seen by another girl who's hitchhiking, which is what she was doing. She was standing by this on-ramp onto the freeway in Eugene, and she had her thumb out, trying to get a ride somewhere. And so, this girl had been in her immediate company for a little while. So when she said, like, oh, yeah, I saw her, this wasn't just a faint glimpse. This was like she had been around her for a while. And Tina is last seen alive climbing into a van that has 2 men inside. Never found out who these men are, where they went. I don't think they got a plate number, so we couldn't, there was no way to figure out who this van belonged to, but Tina got in this van and drove away. And just the following day, Tina hasn't made it home. Her decapitated body was discovered a little ways north of Salem. So, between Eugene and Salem, we don't know exactly what happened. Basic logic says that whoever these guys were that picked her up in the van, they probably did something, horrible to her, including cutting her head off. And, but then again, hey, maybe they picked her up, took her a little ways, dropped her off. She was hitchhiking some more. She got picked up by somebody else who was responsible. That was, there was like a big article post, like a full-page article post that discussed the casual nature with which a lot of people, a lot of young women, teenage girls, would very casually hitchhike and, climb into cars with total strangers. Sometimes dudes a lot older than them. And, when you get into that car, you're putting your life in danger. But, it was, we tend to know a little bit better today now about the terror's potential for hitchhiking. But back then, I think, people kind of knew it in the back of their head. Like, this is probably not a great idea to get into a random car with a random stranger that I don't know and who knows what the hell this person's going to try to do to me. But it just wasn't taken that seriously. Or like, oh, that's not going to happen to me. That happens to other people. It's a very easy mode of thinking to fall into. That doesn't happen to me. That happens to other people. It's how a lot of people have ended up in bad situations. But whatever the case, Her decapitated body was found. It had been kind of left just off to the side of a road in kind of this area that even today, there's not a whole lot out there. It's a couple houses. Just left there. And there was a very interesting story given. A couple people, I want to say it was probably the night before the discovery of her body. They were right in that area. And they said that they saw somebody, like a vehicle, pull up, and they were carrying something heavy out of it and kind of left it in that area. But apparently the police showed up and searched the area and didn't find anything. So they say. And then right in that area, her body's there the next day. So I don't know what to say about that. These guys, maybe they were in slightly different areas. Maybe they were more like a quarter mile up the road. Whatever the circumstances, they say they saw some people ditching something in that area, right where her body was found the night before. But the police seem to implicate that when they got there, they didn't find anything that night. Whatever the case, the following day, a farmer, kind of northeast of Salem, is, out doing whatever work he was doing. And he discovered just the head, just Tina Michelle Megas' head, just left there. I've heard reports that it was left in one of his fields, and that's how the farmer found it. I've also heard that her head had been placed almost strategically in the middle of the road, right next to the farm. So if you turn this corner, start going up that road, you'll just see this head sitting in the middle of the street, which is just frightening as all hell. I'm not dead certain which one is more right. It wouldn't surprise me if the head being in his field was more accurate. It makes it more logical that he found it. It's also less theatrical. The whole finding a severed head in the middle of the street, there's like 70s creepypasta vibes to that almost. But whatever the case, the head that went with the body was found, and they had been displaced several miles apart. Again, one was directly north of Salem, one was more northeast of Salem. So, they weren't that far displaced from one another, and there wasn't really any effort made to hide her. So it seems like whoever was responsible at least took the time to spread the remains out, but didn't really do anything about trying to hide them or conceal them, which a lot of people have done. You do that in the hopes that the remains of the victim are never found, or if at least they are found, it might take a while. You can get like a jump on law enforcement. But in this case, whoever was responsible didn't even need to do that, because we do not know who was responsible for killing her. And I don't even think there's been a legitimate lead, really. Now, of course, again, the police are always going to have more information than I do. But from what I've gathered, the only person that remotely came under suspicion, and I never saw a name given for the person in the newspaper, was this guy in Salem that she reportedly stayed with that police looked into. And again, she's found, her remains are found around Salem. But that guy wasn't even presented a name, and it seemed like he was looked into quickly and then moved on from. So even that guy didn't seem like a really viable suspect. So there's really just been, even like the most troubling of troubling cases where you've got little to go on, there's usually at least a couple of strong theories, maybe 2 or 3 suspects. If this girl was a runaway, who were a lot of the people that she stayed with? Was there some guy that she'd hooked up with that maybe felt like she had wronged him? And again, it could just be some lunatic looking for a victim, picks her up as a hitchhiker, and does his thing. But this is another case that it's one thing to just kill someone, shoot someone dead, asphyxiate them, stab them, whatever. You've had people who, either out of self-defense or, a felt inner need to kill someone. There's lots of instances where you just, there's a difference between people that just kind of shoot someone and leave them. And then there's the stuff that, kind of leans more towards serial killing, where there's a need to do things to the body. if Tina Michelle Minkus was found shot, just shot dead somewhere, you might be able to think up a more simple conclusion. Maybe not. But you could almost think like, she got picked up by the wrong guy and the guy shot her, or maybe he wanted something from her, if you know what I mean, and she fought back and some guy shoots her dead. But when you cut someone's head off, like that's that's unnecessary. That's extra activity. That's a step into a whole other realm. And then you take the time to deposit these remains here and those remains there, separate them out. Someone that you just decapitated, like that's another situation. That's not of the norm, so to speak, when you talk about killing people. That's dismemberment. It's not wild dismemberment like we've seen in the past, but it's dismemberment, which is more specific to a smaller sect of killers. So this is like another case where I'm almost like, were there other cases, at least that kind of had, one of the things about serial killers is, some serial killers, they feel like they got to kill someone every week or every couple of days. Other serial killers, they can go 5-10 years without killing someone. So, if you don't know exactly who you're thinking of, what if, let's say somebody who is a serial killer killed Tina Michelle Minkus, but then didn't kill again until 7 years later. Some woman gets murdered and decapitated in Missouri in 1982. That might not get attention here in Oregon. Like, oh, maybe that's the same person responsible for this case that happened way over here in Oregon 7 years earlier. But it could still be the same person. So it's hard. It'd be real nice if all serial killers just killed. Oh, it wouldn't be nice, but in terms of investigating, because you could find similar cases probably in the same area that happened not too long before or not too long after. So in terms of trying to solve something, it makes it easier, but of course, more people are being killed. So there's really no good way to go about it. But whoever was responsible, whoever did that, it would not surprise me if they had killed others, considering the fact that they went to that length to cut someone's head off. In a case like that, it's unsolved. You have decapitation, you have the runaway who vanishes, you have the mystery guys in the van, and you'd think a case like that would stay alive. It would be a case that would be at least generally known about, kind of in the annals of, bizarre unsolved crime in Oregon. But it's not. It's, this girl had suffered this horrible tragedy, and, aside from those who probably knew her and relatives, either everyone chose to forget, or nobody knew about it in the first place. And it's such a forgotten case, which just breaks my heart. That's what a lot of these cases I cover are cases that don't really get talked about. They'll have their little blip on some cold case record. The local news might do a 2 or 3 minute bit about it. It's been 30 years since so and so died, and we still don't know who did it. Anyway, that's it. Now with the weather. That's why I like covering these cases that are super forgotten. Because they deserve to be revived. They deserve to have attention thrown on them. I think in terms of, all of these cases, not just from this, Salem Corvallis area, but of pretty much any unsolved murder that's happened in Oregon in the 1970s. That's the one that just inside, I feel most invested in. That includes wanting, I want them all to get solved, but that's the one that I really, really wish. It's so neglected, and I don't know if there's, I know there's databases that say whether they have this or not, so it'll be a real easy thing to check, but right here as I'm standing and talking, I don't know if they have. They had the body, and it was the 1970s. I would assume they would have some DNA from Tina, and I don't know if they recovered anything of interest in terms of the little things you find, the fibers from something, hair from a suspect. Her body had been left abandoned for, at least several hours, almost a full day, or at least half a day, and her head had, been away even longer. So I would think they got at least some DNA from her, and as long as you've got some DNA on file, there's always the chance that you will get that resolution that, any family that's had to endure watching a loved one experience something like that, and then having to deal with sometimes years, decades of no one being brought to justice for it. You have that hope. Twice I've said, I don't know if happy's the right term when these cold cases finally get filed or get solved. I feel like it's more relief, is it? But I'll tell you what, if Tina Michelle, if really any of these cases get definitively solved, but just for me, especially Tina's case, I will pop open a bottle of champagne for that one, and I will do a drink to her. And I feel like I would do that for any of these cases. One of the focuses, most of all, in this series is that I'm covering a lot of older cases. I don't think I've covered a case any later than I don't think I've covered a case that happened before I was born. And there are a lot of these cases that are from the 70s and further back. A lot of older cases that are sitting there waiting. Hopefully a lot of them are waiting to ultimately be solved one day, and I'll crack open a drink to celebrate any of those. And I'll make sure to let you guys know about it. Hey, this case I covered, it's been solved. Hence, here's my glass of champagne. At least something happened. Some resolution was found. And yeah, I think unless it's someone might someday notice a connection between somebody else that was doing something similar or someone else that was just committing violent crimes during that time in the 70s, either lived in the Pacific Northwest, Oregon area, or at least passed through there a time or two. Because I feel like the Peters case, the Migas case, I feel like a lot of these cases were the work of somebody that, these weren't the only people that they did something bad to. And maybe they had other victims they murdered. Maybe they had victims that got away that could identify them. That's how I was going to say that. I don't know why I was going to say that word that way. But yeah, I feel like unless there's some DNA break, unless there's some new information that comes to light, or unless someone can make a connection with some of these cases and other cases that happen, and maybe find out if a certain someone wasn't in Oregon when these events happened, and maybe there's something to tie someone to these cases, they absolutely still can be solved. And I know that there's other cases that have happened, involving unsolved murders, people who've disappeared from this particular sect of Oregon back in the 70s. There's some that I've forgotten about, some that I've only seen the names, don't really know the details of the case, things I need to look into more. But it's just very interesting because it was a succession of cases that mostly happened. I've kind of narrowed it to the Corvallis, Salem area, but these things that happened kind of between almost Portland and Eugene, at least a ways south of the Portland area and a little ways north of kind of the Eugene area. And just this string of crimes, a few of which have been solved, but a lot of them still loom. Because, I started just, a couple years ago, I started just looking into, hey, I just want to find interesting unsolved murders. And I found myself noticing rather quickly, actually, that there was I was seeing this kind of consistent string of, young women, some of which were teenagers to young women, individuals between the age of it's a pretty wide gap, but still young people, ages 13, 14 to 30 in the case of the Owens case. I want to say Jean Peters was around 30 years old as well. And I don't think they're all interconnected with each other, but it's this representation of its time, Pretty much starting in the 60s and peaking in the 80s, there was this increase, kind of all manners of violent crime in America, and they were spiking everywhere. East Coast, West Coast, everywhere in between. I think up until last year, unfortunately, Portland's most, worst year for homicides, I think was 87. And we unfortunately eclipsed that last year. But we really started seeing the big spike during the 70s that led to how things were in the 80s. And the 70s was when serial killers really started taking off. There were, serial killers existed before then, but not in such great abundance as they did during the 70s. And, it's possible some of these unsolved cases were the work of serial killers. It's just as much possible that they could have died under a series of different situations. Some of these murders may have even been accidents. I mean, obviously, in the case of people like Jean Peters and Tina Migas, obviously those, people were brutalized, and the Dades too, but so much mystery encapsulating certain types of individuals in a certain area. It's just very, very intriguing. Because, I'd look up like Oregon Unsolved, murders. And so many of them were focused in the Willamette Valley between Portland and Eugene. When, you've got a whole bunch of other places. You got places further south. You got the Oregon coast. You got places like Bend, Prineville, Redmond, in kind of the middle. And even though it's, more sparsely populated east, there's still towns, there's still people. You still think there's something out there. But I noticed a really major focus in the 70s in that particular area. I also, Salem's the capital, and there's usually history in most state capital cities that state capitals tend to sometimes attract a fringe criminal element, which, again, I don't know if that applies to this, but I just know that that's historically been a thing. I know there's parts, especially today, there's parts of Salem, like Portland, that you kind of just don't want to be in. But that is what I wanted to talk about today in my little ramble. And I do enjoy doing these, even though sometimes I forget little details. I just like being able to reflect on these because sometimes it's harder to reflect on them even as I'm doing videos on these cases, because a lot of times I'm out there, I'm in the elements, I'm having to deal with whatever the weather's like, I'm having to look out for homeless people following me around, sometimes just having a lot of other people around in general and trying to get through it and maintain your thoughts while there's all this, commerce going on. Those all make things more difficult and complicates matters when you're out on the scene trying to do videos. So in a more serene setting like this, it becomes a little bit easier to focus on the matter at hand, and I can reflect on these cases that I've covered in the past and reflect on them more deeply, even though now that I think about it, these are pretty much all cases I've covered in videos that I did at home, so I guess the whole being out and about in Portland or whatever doesn't really apply here. But in most cases it does. So there. And yeah, I want to continue just kind of doing these from time to time for, like everything else on my channel, for the fun of it, because I enjoy it. And hopefully you enjoy them too. If nothing more, there's something for you to listen to while you're busy at work doing whatever. I know some of my videos where I sit there and chat, some people have said they just put on while they're doing like chores around the house. And hey, if I'm helping you get through the monotonous world of chore doing, you're welcome. For me, if I'm doing chores, I have to have music playing. It just makes it so much easier and pleasant. I can be scrubbing down a bathtub, but I'm also like rocking out at the same time. So yeah, I'm going to continue doing these. This is the second one I've done in this series thus far. And the next one I want to do is kind of comparable to this one in terms of focusing on a particular area, a particular time period, and a particular type of victim. That being during the 1920s and 30s, all of the women that were like pretty much single women who lived on their own, which was, not that common of a thing back then. These early independent women that could actually afford to have their own place and live on their own. They didn't need a man to come along and support them. A string of, murders happened that there's a lot of correlation between what happened, the victims involved, all of that. So I think I want to do that for my next episode in terms of delving a little bit more deeply into things I've covered in the past, getting a little bit more out of it. So all of that said, thank you so much for stopping by. Hope this was at least moderately entertaining. if not modestly, I guess. And if you like what I'm doing, you like what you're seeing or like what you're hearing, you want to help out a fella's channel a little bit, remember to like, share, subscribe. I'm trying to continuously keep growing. I'm getting slowly ever so closer to 5,000 subs. Every little bit helps. I also have Patreon. The link to that is in the description below if you want to help me out that way. Makes doing what I do a little bit easier. So there's a link to that. There's a link to my Facebook, Instagram, and a Reddit subreddit. God, I don't know how to talk anymore. Reddit subreddit, whatever. They're all linked there. And all that said, one more time, thank you so much for stopping by, for listening. If you made it all the way to the end, you are a trooper. Steve the Amateur Historian, I will see you next time.